All right, everybody, welcome to the Air War podcast presented by Pursuit Pix Media. My name is Mitchell Babarvich, joined by my co-host Sam Allen, and we are talking Masters of the Air Part 4, the episode that apparently is boring to some of you, but it was certainly not to us. A lot of themes in this episode, Sam. Let's go ahead and start with the phone call and
Yeah, start with the
spoilers.
end.
We're gonna start with the end, and we're gonna throw a bunch of spoilers at you, including stuff you
Mhm.
didn't see on camera.
Yes, the spoilers for episode 5 as well.
Yeah, maybe some for the next episode. So please be aware. The phone call is what hooked me into the book. The
hmm
prologue in Donald Miller's book, Masters of the Air, um, is called The Bloody Hundredth. And he starts talking about Egan initially. And Egan is in a hotel in London on a 2-day leave. He wakes up in the morning, goes down to have breakfast, picks up a paper, reads it, and sees how many fortresses were lost over Bremen. I think it was 30. Did it say in that headline?
Yeah,
It was
30. Yeah, 30.
something like that. And then as soon as he saw that, he called the base, and basically that phone call conversation is more or less what happened. So in the book, it reads, he sprang out of his chair and rushed to a phone to call the base. With wartime security tight, the conversation was in code. How did the game go? He asked. Clevin had gone down swinging, he was told. And he's being told this by Red Bowman. Red Bowman was the operations officer. And let's talk about Red Bowman real quick before I continue with this. Red Bowman is a major part of why Donald Miller went with the
Mhm.
100th, because Bowman recorded all of his notes in a very detailed, almost story-like diary.
They are beautiful.
Yeah, they really are. And you can check out some of those entries on the 100th Bomb Group Foundation website. So Egan asked, how did the game go? Clevin had gone down swinging, he was told. Pulling himself together, Egan asked, does the team have a game scheduled for tomorrow? Yes, came the reply. I want to pitch, was Egan's answer to that. And boy, if that doesn't hook you into a book, I'm not sure what does.
Yeah,
But
because it's right at the beginning, isn't it?
it's 10 pages into the
Yeah.
prologue, and the prologue again is called The Bloody Hundredth. So it was cool to see that in this episode. And I liked the creative liberties that they did, and you know, round of applause for John Orloff. That was a really effective way to communicate that scene, because just prior to that, Egan had slept with the Polish woman,
hmm
and which was a really great character, by the way. Um,
I think she's my favorite this episode, to be
it,
honest. And that,
yeah, great perspective from
yes.
her. But when he's sitting in the chair and he's looking out the window, and the Germans are night bombing. I mean, I guess they weren't necessarily bombing London because he was in London, or maybe I don't.
No,
Was that
they were,
London?
but I'll get onto that.
Okay, all right, we'll get to that in a sec. Anyways, but there's a part where Egan says, "I'm not used to being on the business end of the bomb." And
hmm
then the next afternoon, not morning because he slept in late, uh, he's walking down that street and sees the mother crying over the death of her
Yeah.
little girl. Boy, that tugged on some heartstrings.
I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting scenes of destruction and all that, but I wasn't expecting just something so
Yeah,
raw.
absolutely, absolutely. So since we're talking about the Germans bombing
hmm
England, why don't you go ahead and pick that up, Sam?
So, so Egan was in London, but he was in the West End of London, which got very little of the bombing, especially when compared to the East End of London, which is at the mouth of the River Thames. So you've got all the docks, you've also got a large amount of the industrial works there, whereas the West End is mainly a residential area. So there was very little use in bombing the West End. So that's why he could just sit in a hotel window and look out and,
Right.
not have to go down to the shelter or anything. But because at this point in the war, there's very little in the way of German bombing of Britain, just because the RAF and the US's fighter groups are just in an overwhelming strength now,
And
and
this is the fall
especially
of 1943.
yes,
Just so everybody knows where we're at.
but the Germans do start terror raids, and this is, I think, meant to be the beginning of those, where they were just, it was called the Little Blitz, and it wasn't very effective, but it was mainly a propaganda thing
Mm,
for the Germans, that they're still hitting England even though we're getting pounded into oblivion. That was their thinking.
right.
Um, but it's there was one thing I'm sad that they didn't include in the raid that we saw. There was no barrage balloons. London would have been covered in them, but you
Oh,
couldn't see
okay.
any there.
Yeah.
And so that was a little bit sad. But
That's
overall, it
interesting.
looks, yeah. And say, but overall, it looks very good.
You know,
And say,
well, I want to point this out real quick since you're going to ruin that scene for people. I'm going to go ahead and ruin something for you. So in the second episode of Band of Brothers, when the C-47s are flying over the Cotton
mm-hmm.
Peninsula on D-Day and they're dropping all those guys, go look for the searchlights.
Fuck all, is
There aren't any. Or at least I
there?
don't remember there being any. But
No, it's all Tracer and all that.
but I gotta say that CGI in that scene was really well done. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I was immersed.
Yeah, it looks real. And say, because there are a few bits in Masters of the Air so far that the CGI's been a bit iffy, but this is one of the scenes where it looks real. It
Yeah,
doesn't look like CGI.
yeah, absolutely. And we didn't. This is not a very combat heavy episode. However, talking about the CGI, I thought the CGI at the end of the episode where the B-17 is in its hard stand and you
Yeah.
can see that there's a very large piece of battle damage around the waist, and then part
Hmm.
of the tail looks like a shark bit it off. I thought that was pretty effective. Other than some of the smoke looked a little
Yeah.
sketchy. And it looks and the only reason I say that is because it looks sketchy on my Samsung TV in the other room, and then it didn't look so good on my monitor here. So that's the I only feel comfortable saying that because
Well,
it didn't look too good from different
yeah.
perspectives.
Well, smoke's one of those really difficult things to
Absolutely.
animate, so it's
Totally.
forgivable.
Totally. Um, so we're gonna try and present you guys some information,
Hmm.
particularly about things that weren't shown. So the Bremen raid, they didn't skip it, they just didn't show
Yeah.
them bomb Bremen. Okay. So this is October 8th, 1943.
Yeah.
And Clevin gets shot down. So let's go ahead and talk about what happened to Clevin. I've got it pulled up in the book right here, and I'll just kind of read what Miller says in the book. Three Luftwaffe fighters flew out of the sun and tore into his fortress, knocking out three engines and blowing holes in the tail and the nose, shearing off a good part of the left wing, and setting the cockpit on fire. The situation hopeless. Clevin ordered the crew to jump. He was the last man out. When he jumped, the bomber was only 2,000 feet from the ground. So typically bombing missions are, I'll say no lower than 15,000 feet, although that's pretty low. Maybe I think from most of the accounts I read, it's 17 to 25 and
Yeah.
sometimes 30,000.
Higher the better normally, to be
Yeah,
fair.
yeah. If you were in the higher squadron, the greater the chance you had
Yeah.
of making it through. So he bails out, and this is pretty wild, and I think this might have been hard to show, but hanging from his chute, Clevin saw he was going to land near a small farmhouse, and faster than I wanted to. Swinging in his chute to avoid the house, he spun out of control and went through the open back door and into the kitchen, knocking over furniture and a small iron stove. The farmer's wife and daughter began screaming hysterically, and in a flash, the farmer had a pitchfork pressed against Clevin's chest. In my pitiful high school German, I tried to convince them that I was a good guy. He wasn't buying it. That night, some of the men in Clevin's squadron who had survived the Bremen mission walked to a village pub and got extravagantly drunk. None of them could believe he was gone, said Sergeant Jack Sheridan, another member of Clevin's squadron. If Clevin the Invincible couldn't make it, who could? Now, Sam mentioned before we started recording that this is a significant episode in terms of the U.S. Army Air Force personnel. So, Sam, I'm going to go ahead
Yeah.
and hand the ball to you.
Yeah, because it's basically the death of the pre-war Air Corps. Because most of those pre-war regulars and some of the first few volunteers that joined after Pearl Harbor,
Right.
they're basically gone now. They're either in very small numbers or they're being promoted, so they're no longer flying. It's predominantly all either draftees or volunteers, whatever you want to call it. So it's a completely new breed of pilots and aircrew, and I think it seems very odd to me because from a British point of view, the death of our regular army, air force, so on and so forth, happened in 1940 and 41.
Mm.
So it's very odd for me to see those pre-war flyers still in their aircraft.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is the first episode where we start seeing replacement pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's go ahead and talk about the first crew to complete 25 missions. So that aircraft was flown by Glenn Dye, and you can read a little bit about Glenn Dye in Damn Lucky by John Luckadoo. If I'm not mistaken, John Luckadoo, who was a replacement pilot, was the
Mm-hmm.
second pilot in the 100th to complete 25 combat missions. Now,
Well,
I just wanted I got to point this out because I'm going to forget this stat because it took me forever to fricking find it in the book. Um, of the original crews in the 100th, and I think in the show they say 35 planes from Greenland. It's either 35 or 36. So
mhm.
of those 35 or 36 crews, I'm going to say 36. Only 14% made it to 25 missions. That's of those 35 to 36 original crews of the 100th bomb group. 14% made it to 25 missions.
Thank God the pilots, well, the air crews probably didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
Because obviously they knew the number would be low, but at least thank God they didn't know it was 14%. Otherwise, I think they all would have had nervous breakdowns.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And speaking of breakdown, let's talk about the flak farm. Now the flak farm, and it didn't exactly show it like this in the series, but it's implied that crews needed to have R&R. They needed to have rest and
Yeah.
recreation, which is what they gave to Egan. But I think what they tried to do in this episode was show the psychological toll that it was taking on the crews. And there's that point where Egan mentions how the guys who they came with, it's starting to thin out,
Yeah.
and they're realizing that eventually they're going to forget about us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the flak farms, while they didn't show it in this episode, a lot of guys like Egan would go on recreation, and if they went to a flak farm, those were manor houses that donated to the RAF, leased to the 8th Air Force, and basically it was a facility that made the environment unmilitary and tried to show guys that this is what you're fighting for,
Yeah.
right? If you keep flying and you make it, then everything will go back to normal like how it is here.
I think this is where the RAF has it lucky, is because they can just jump on a train and they're back home. They're literally home.
Absolutely. Good point. Good point, Sam.
Members of the 8th can't do that. They can't, jump on a boat and go 5,000 miles across the Atlantic, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And say, so they definitely have it much harder.
Yeah, it's you got to keep guys from going insane. One
I
thing.
genuinely. Oh,
Go
go
ahead,
on,
Sam.
sorry.
No. Go ahead, Sam.
No, I was just going to say, I genuinely thought Chick Harding was about to have a fucking breakdown in that scene in the bar. I'm like, is he drunk or is he halfway to the loony bin? I wasn't 100% sure in that moment.
Yeah, and let's talk about Chick Harding. And we're gonna talk about him through Robert Rosenthal. So
Mm.
I was pretty excited to see that Rosie is now in the show because that's a character, and we won't talk about him too much because we didn't get a whole hell of a lot of him.
No.
But we're gonna get a lot of him next episode. Which, by
You're a
the
bit of a
way,
fanboy of Rosie,
I
aren't
am. I am.
you?
And everybody should mentally prepare for next week if you thought Regensburg was bad, oh, just wait for episode 5. Now Rosenthal arrived among the first group of replacements to Thorpe Abbott's in the late summer of 1943, and he didn't fly a combat mission for a month, and he attributed this to a lack of discipline in the 100th, and notes that that mostly had to do with Harding. And it wasn't because Harding was a bad commander. All those guys really liked Chick Harding. He was just very laid back, and
Yeah.
things would slip through the cracks, right? So that's why it took Rosenthal over a month to fly a combat mission, and he wasn't even immediately checked out in a B-17,
Oh,
which is kind of odd, right? As soon as you get these pilots and crew, you need to check these guys out and make sure they know their
yeah.
shit. So that was just another note that
Well,
I
that's
wanted
odd
to
because
point out.
there's that little bit where Egan and Cleven are first meeting Rosie, and they talk about how they'd heard he's a great flyer, but
Right.
how when
How
you
would they
haven't even,
know?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. I didn't even think
Mm.
about that. Um, let's see what else we got. Oh, okay. The comment line.
Ah,
Let's talk about that. Okay, so we're following um Sergeant William Quinn and Charles Bailey. So those are the two gunners from Biddick's crew who bailed out, and we're
mhm.
following them through this because again we're exploring themes with Masters of the Air. So this is escape and evasion, and these guys are being what's the word I'm looking for? Not funneled, but they're being taken through the Comet line, which was
Yeah.
set up in Brussels by a 25-year-old woman. Sam, why don't you say her name? Because my French is
Oh,
terrible.
I've forgotten it now.
Oh,
It's
okay, and Andre Dijon.
Andre, yeah, Andre de Jong or something like that.
Okay, for the viewing audience, I'll throw up her name on the screen because I don't want to do
We
her any injustice. So that woman was a true badass.
Yes, she was
Um,
mad.
Yeah, she took. I mean, what she's a hero. Let's
Hmm.
face it, and that whole organization was. So the Comet line ran from. I have Brussels in my notes, Sam. So it ran from. We'll call it Belgium just to make it easy, but it
Yeah.
ran from Belgium to Gibraltar, 1,200 miles. And if you want to read more about this in the book, there's a section in chapter 4 called "Escape and Evasion," where Donald
Hmm.
Miller goes big time into her story, how she got it started, how many Allied airmen she was able to get out. But just a truly spectacular woman. Survived the war, and she died when she was 90 years old. So she lived a totally full life. And
I'm pretty sure she was forgotten about after the war, though. I
I
think it
wouldn't
wasn't
be
until a
surprised.
later life that anyone either remembered or bothered talking to her.
Yeah, could be. That could
Uh,
be.
I'd say because the comment line is very interesting because it's one of the most successful. There were lots of these lines running from anywhere from Denmark all the way down to the Biscay coast of France, and there were lots of different lines, and sometimes they ended up working against each other without knowing it
Right.
because the British intelligence unit MI9 was the predominant liaison between any escape related attempts in mainland Europe and the resistance lines and so on and so forth. And MI9 really let them down because they would fund them in terms of helping pay for, where they're staying, supplies, stuff like that. But they've offered very little support apart from that.
Hmm. Interesting.
And so, which I don't understand, considering you're getting, because throughout the war, I think it's between 5,000 and 6,000 pilots come through all of these lines with very little support. They're mostly doing it on their own, and I think that's just amazing.
Yeah, and I had the stats. Oh, right here. The Comet Line aided approximately 700 of the 5 to
Mm,
6,000 downed Allied airmen. 3,000 of them Americans who eventually made it back to England. So the Comet Line played a very significant role
yeah.
into getting Allied airmen back to the UK. So we wanted to make sure that we took a few minutes to talk about Andre Dijon. Hopefully that's right. People can kill me in the comments later. Doesn't bother
Yeah, it's
me.
probably not. We're
Yeah,
probably
that's
idiots.
that's okay with that's okay by me. I'll be the first to admit it. So let's talk about the Bremen raid.
Hmm.
So they don't show they show the takeoff and they show the landing, those who make it back, right? I like this a lot because it reminded me of a book called Mustang Ace by Robert Goebel, and any World War II aviation American aviation guy is probably familiar with that book. There's a part in Goebel's book where he flies his longest mission. He shoots down 3 planes, and he's the last P-51 to land. Okay, and the 31st Fighter Group ground crews would um, basically wait along the taxiway for their planes to come home. And then the 3 guys who were assigned to each plane would jump on the wing and ride the plane back as the pilot would taxi to the hard stand. Okay.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, pretty interesting. So Goebel lands, he gets his 3 guys on his P-51 and he holds up a 3, and those guys are all slapping each other on the back because it's like, because it's their plane too.
Hmm.
And one sobering part is as he's taxiing back, he sees the last crew, the last 3 guys waiting for their plane to come home. I immediately thought of that as soon as they're counting all those B-17s coming home, and
Yeah,
then they show Ralph Law, who is great, by the way, as Ken Lemons, and those guys are fucking pissed because they know that there's that
yeah.
that this was a heavy mission for them, and some of their planes weren't coming back.
One thing we need to talk about: did Lemons actually ride the wheel of a B-17
Well, I see.
trying to
I
fix?
I don't know, and he has a book apparently. I've
Oh,
tried I've tried searching for it. I think it's a PDF somewhere that's basically
right.
a collection of his memoirs. But that's one of those stories that I don't think you can make that up.
No,
Would be my
it's
guess.
such a mad thing to do that if you'd have wrote that as a piece of fiction, no one would think it was realistic.
Yeah,
So it's got to be one of
that's a
those
good point.
things that it's got to be one of those things where it's like, yes, this happened. I know it sounds like it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I know that there's some members of the Lemons family on the 100th bomb group. Facebook, or not 100 bomb group, the Masters of the Air Facebook group.
Mm,
So I'm sure that there'll be some info on that somewhere,
yeah.
and maybe we can bring that up later. So the return to Bremen. This mission is on October 8th, 1943. Uh, let's go ahead and hit you with the stats. Sam and I were a little confused
Hmm.
about the dialogue in the series, and there's good reason for that. Nobody had landed at Thorpe Abbott's yet from that mission, and they were trying to figure out who was shot down, how many in total were shot down. Um, so, from A Wing and a Prayer by Harry Crosby, October 8th, 1943 lists 7 crews lost. Now, I think the reason why they mention, God, did they say 9 in the show?
8.
8, is that what? Okay. So they sent out 24. At least that's what they said in the show.
Yeah.
My notes from A Wing and a Prayer show that 21 B-17s formed up after the assembly. And of those 21, 7 were lost, 9 were damaged, and 3 of those that made it back landed at other fields. Crosby's B-17, he was flying with Jack Kidd and Everett Blakely. They landed at RAF Ludham because their B-17 had the shit shot out of it, and Kidd and Blakely were able to land that plane without brakes and clipped a tree on the field, which we'll throw up the picture of Crosby next to that B-17 and the tree sticking through the nose of the
Yeah. I
plane.
know what they've done in the show because what they say is because you said 9 were damaged. In the show, they said 11 were damaged. So that's where those extra aircraft had come from.
Okay. Okay, that totally checks out. One note from Crosby's book that I wanted to bring up was a B-17 nicknamed Miscarriage. God. Uh, yeah, so this how much time do we have left on Zoom? Oh,
10
we got
minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, we're
Yeah.
fine. Okay, so this B-17 named Miscarriage was flown by Edward Stork. It flew home on one engine and no oxygen system.
I would not want to do that.
It's
No
insane.
oxygen.
Absolutely insane. The total air crew lost for this, according to Crosby's book, is 72 airmen.
Mm.
So two guys were killed on the in some of the aircraft that returned home. Are not killed, but well, in all likelihood, those guys were either killed or wounded on the return home,
Yeah.
or parachuted out. Um, it's important to point out that not every B-17, not every bomber that made it home, everybody in the plane survived, right?
We see that in the last episode
Yeah,
with Cleven's aircraft because he's got one dead, is it?
yeah. The guy who, well, Norman Smith was his name.
Yeah,
As I
Norman
were,
Smith gets his legs blown off. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I want to point that out just because Donald Miller says it in the book. He either says it in the book, but I know he said it in several interviews. There's no
Mm.
foxholes in a B-17.
No.
There's nowhere to hide, man. Nowhere to
But
hide.
we've talked about this, is that how vulnerable you are in a B-17.
Yep.
But when we see like the pictures at the time of like how we talked about the aircraft Crosby was in that's completely battered, and it's like they're also incredibly durable as well, though.
Yeah.
It's an odd paradox.
Yeah. There's armor in just the right amount of places,
Yeah.
but not all of it. Um, so that's the stats that I have.
Hmm.
So this is again, it was another shitty mission for the 100th. So at this point, and I've just to show you guys in the book, and I would highly recommend picking up A Wing and a Prayer. Crosby has, and I'll show it real quick because there's a lot of dates on there. But Crosby has a couple different graphics in this book, and one of which is the 100th awful 8 mission. So there were 8 missions where at least 7 B-17s were lost,
Yeah.
7 or more. So August 17th, 1943, the Regensburg mission, 9 B-17s are lost. October 8th, 1943, Bremen loses 7, and we'll save it for next week as to how many they lose for the Munster raid on October 10th, 1943. And mind you, it's a 2-day difference between this mission's episode and next mission's episode.
Yeah. They're going to have to do a lot of jumping around because obviously next episode is episode 5, and they've only covered 6 months so far. They've got another year and a bit to go, so they're going to have to do a lot of jumping around.
Yeah, they are, and I think it's safe to say that they will probably wrap up the escape and evasion sequence in the next episode. Before
I
we
don't
forget,
know.
before we forget, how did you know he was a German?
Yes. Well, because I think we mentioned this last week. We watch the episode right before we record these, but we also watch it, when it first comes out when we get a chance to. So the first time I watched it, it was the lighter. So the German spy, he's got a German lighter, which seems like a really dumb thing for the Abwehr to do, to give their agents a German lighter.
Mhm.
But anyway, but then rewatching it, he writes the date in the European style, which is day, month, year, rather than the American month, day, year.
Which good filmmaking on that, by the way. There's a very
Hmm.
subtle shot of that Belgian man who's interrogating them that show, he kind of glances at how he wrote it.
Yeah.
So Sam being the really smart guy between the two of us noticed that. Me being the American was like, he didn't sing that part of the Star Spangled Banner right. So he said, just so proudly we hailed, when it's what so proudly we hailed. And I made
Mm,
sure to go back to the earliest version of that
yeah.
of our anthem that I could find, and there at no point did I see that line was what so proudly. So he should have said just so proudly we hailed. But I noticed that immediately. Didn't notice the other two at all.
And just as a very little interesting historical point, the American anthem that we know today was only adopted in 1931.
Yeah, right.
Before then, it was Hail Columbia, I want to say.
Yeah, again, I mean, you're teaching me shit here, Sam. I wouldn't know. That's funny shit. Yeah, Sam's the historian of everything, in case you guys couldn't tell. Um, Okay,
disturbingly.
so that pretty much wraps it up. There was a lot to go on here.
Mhm.
This was not a boring episode, regardless of what
No,
what
no, no,
people
no.
say. Um, some nice scenes with the American Red Cross Club Mobile ladies,
Yeah.
and a heartbreaker for sure.
Hmm.
Also, an early scene that shows, I'll call it leadership, but for Rosenthal to take it on upon himself to go tell her,
Yes.
shows a lot about the kind of man that he was.
I missed it. What rank is he at the moment?
He's a lieutenant.
Right. Okay.
Yep, yep. And then he'll, I mean, God, so that was his. I think that was his second mission. Next week is his third, and then he flies 49
Yeah.
more. It's
He's because
insane.
he's only beat by Egan, isn't he?
At this, well,
As in
what
through the whole war in the 100th. He's only beat by Egan, isn't
oh, no, there was one other guy who
he? Oh, was
flew.
there?
I can't think of his name, and I feel terrible for saying that because I just bought a and I'll show this on our next podcast episode, but I
Hmm.
just bought a huge painting by Robert Taylor, who just recently passed away, the famous aviation artist. But
Oh, did he?
yeah, yeah,
Oh.
he did a painting of Thor Babbitt's, and there's two B-17
Mm.
sitting on the ground. But one of the guys who signed that, I think he had the second most combat missions in the 100th. It was over 40.
Right.
It was over 40. I know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like because Egan did, was it 57?
Egan never made it that far.
Didn't he?
No, Egan never made it that far.
Who the hell am I thinking
Spoiler
of then?
alert. Spoiler alert. We're down to the last 3 minutes of this podcast episode. So if you don't want to hear the spoiler for the next episode, shut it off right now. Egan gets shot down in the next episode.
Yeah. I
And
thought he got back and then did another tour.
they made it in their no,
Who the
no.
hell am I thinking of?
I don't know, but we're gonna find out, and we'll let you know on the next podcast. Because now I'm curious.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that'll pretty much wrap it up. While so Sam and I can go dive in
Yeah.
and figure out what the hell he's taught. The historian of everything doesn't know this one thing.
As soon as you say
Yeah.
that.
You heard it here first. So we got an Instagram page now. So be sure to go check that out. It is at Air War Podcast. We'll throw that up on the screen. Please go give us a follow on that. If we missed anything, send us an email at pursuitpics@gmail.com.
And I also accept abusive messages calling me an idiot.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, send the hate mail to Sam. God, I think that's it. I think we've actually hit everything in the notes. I tried not to go over the top
Yeah.
with all my notes.
I'd say I've still got stuff, but we've got less than a minute left. Less than 2 minutes left.
Well,
now,
I
so.
think what we'll do is once the series is out in its entirety, we'll do a huge overview.
Yeah, an appendices sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Where we can do like a 90-minute podcast episode dedicated to each part of the series. But we got to get through the series first, which God, we're halfway through it. We got 5 more.
Yeah.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We got 5 more episodes to go, plus the documentary. So,
Oh yes, don't forget about that.
yeah, looking forward to that. Okay, guys, we're out of here for the Air War Podcast. My name is Mitchell Barvich, joined by Sam Allen, and thank you to well, no, that's my own business. I shouldn't be thinking my own business, but this was presented by Pursuit Picks Media, and give us a follow on Spotify and go subscribe to us on YouTube. Appreciate it.
So.